In this video, we are going to show you the basic structure of the syslog simulator and how to configure both the management application and the endpoint server. In a full installation of the simulator, as demonstrated in our last video, you will install both the management application and endpoint server. The management application allows you to create, edit, and send syslog messages. The endpoint server sends the messages to the syslog servers that have been defined by the user in its configuration. It consists of two parts. The first part is the REST endpoint server through which it interacts with client applications. The second part is the distribution engine, which forwards the syslog messages received from the clients to their respective syslog receivers. Now we will see how to configure both the client application and endpoint server. Open the Management application and go to the Settings tab. You will see two buttons for configuring the system. The Sim Manager settings are for configuring the manager application that we are currently using. These settings are stored in the config file shown. The log level setting controls the amount of detail shown in the log window at the bottom of the main screen. The protocol allows you to choose between HTTP and HTTPS with credentials depending on how the endpoint has been configured. The endpoint settings are used to configure the endpoint service and distribution engine. These settings can be initially loaded from the config file itself if the endpoint is unreachable and the management application resides on the same machine. In most instances, though, we can retrieve the endpoint settings directly from the endpoint itself. There are two parts to setting up the endpoint server. The first part is setting up the endpoint itself. You can set the log level of the endpoint to control the amount of detail seen in the logs. The endpoint is a REST endpoint and it will need to bind to an IP and a port. You can also set the protocol to HTTP or HTTPS. If you use HTTPS, you can optionally set a username and password. However, you must set up the cert, root cert, and key files for OpenSSL. Instructions for creating these files can be found in the help guide. You can enter the full path of these files. If you enter only the file names, the server will look for them in the cert's subdirectory relative to its install path. The queue count and queue timeout thresholds control the engine's send rate. If either of these are set to 0, messages are sent by the distribution engine as soon as they are received. If they are both non-zero, then the outbound messages are sent when the conditions are met. In this case, the messages will be sent when there are at least 100 messages in the queue, or it has been 30 seconds since the last send, whichever comes first. The second part of the endpoint configuration is the distribution engine. The distribution engine consists of one or more outbound queues configured to send test messages to syslog receivers using whichever network protocols are selected. Each receiver must be identified by a unique name. This name can be anything. In this example, we'll call it local. Next, it must have a host name or IP address and a port. Finally, you can select a protocol. Note that a UDP receiver configured on a host can use the same port as a TLS or TCP receiver on that host, but TCP and TLS receivers must all have their own ports. Load balancer forwarding simulation simulates messages that have been passed through load balancers and had forward headers prepended to them along with the originating IP and the IPs of the forwarders. For TCP receivers, there are additional options. The TCP/TLS delimiter field allows you to select the delimiter used to separate messages in the TCP stream. It will also allow you to select transparent framing, also called octet counting, where the message is preceded by the message length and no delimiters are sent. Setting Use Persistent TCP Connection to True causes the distribution engine to connect to that receiver on startup and stay connected until it shuts down, even when the outbound queue for that receiver is empty and there are no pending messages to send. When the Do Not Send delimiter on last message option is checked, the engine will not send the delimiter after the last message prior to closing the TCP connection. This option is not available if the persistent TCP connection option is selected. The Export button will allow you to export the configuration in JSON format for use in automation. This concludes our introduction to the configuration of the All Things Syslog Simulator tool. Thank you, and we hope you found this presentation useful.